The storm came without warning, as most disasters do in the Arizona Territory. One moment, Eleanor Nora Keene stood at her ranch fence watching thunderheads build over the distant mesas. And the next, the sky split open with a lightning that turned the desert white as bone. She'd seen plenty of summer storms in her 3 years alone on this hard-scrabble patch of land. But something about this one set her teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way her horses paced in their corral, or how the air tasted of copper and dust, or maybe it was just the loneliness that made every shadow seem darker these days. The ranch wasn't much a 2-room adobe house, a barn that leaked in 3 places, and 40 acres of stubborn soil that fought her every attempt at cultivation. But it was hers, bought with the last of what her late husband Patrick had saved from his years as a cavalry sergeant. The consumption had taken him 2 winters past, leaving her with debts, memories, and a determination to prove she didn't need anyone's pity or protection. Thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire. Nora secured the chicken coop and checked the barn door latches, her split skirt heavy with dust and sweat. At 26, she'd grown lean and hard as jerky, her Irish skin burnt brown by the desert sun, her hands rough as any cow hands, the few times she went to town for supplies. The proper ladies whispered behind their fans about that peculiar Keene woman. But Nora had learned not to care. Survival took precedence over reputation out here. The first drops of rain hit like bullets, sending up puffs of dust from the packed earth. Nora hurried toward the house, but stopped when she heard its hoofbeats, fast and hard, coming from the north. Her hand went instinctively to the Springfield rifle she kept by the door. Raiders came with the storm sometimes, using the weather as cover. But these riders weren't trying to hide. They burst over the ridge in a thunder of their own 5, 6, maybe 7 riders pushing their mounts hard. In the flickering lightning, Nora caught glimpses of long hair, buckskin, the glint of metal, Apache. Her finger found the trigger, but she hesitated. Something was wrong with the picture. These riders weren't attacking, they were running. Behind them, barely visible through the sheets of rain, came more horsemen in the blue of cavalry uniforms. The Apache riders swerved toward her ranch, probably seeking the cover of her barn. Nora raised the rifle, shouting over the storm, "Stop right there, this is private property." The lead rider pulled up his paint horse so sharp it nearly sat. In the next flash of lightning, Nora saw his face clearly strong features, skin weathered dark, eyes that held both wariness and something like respect. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with a small scar through his left eyebrow. "We mean no harm," he called out in English, his voice carrying despite the wind, "only shelter from the storm." "You've got cavalry on your tail," Nora shot back. "I don't need that kind of trouble." "Neither do we." The man's horse danced nervously as thunder cracked overhead. "They chase us for being Apache, nothing more. We've taken nothing, killed no one." Nora might have told them to keep riding, might have sided with her own kind as she'd been taught, but something in the man's voice, the way he controlled his horse with subtle shifts of weight, the fact that he'd stopped when she'd commanded it, it all spoke of a different story than the one she'd heard in town about savage raids. Then she saw the others more clearly. 2 were barely more than boys. An older woman sat a gray mare, her face proud despite exhaustion. These weren't warriors on a raid. They were people running for their lives. "The barn," she said, lowering the rifle slightly. "But if you bring trouble to my door..." The lead rider nodded once, understanding passing between them. He called something in Apache to the others, and they moved toward the barn, quick but not threatening. That's when everything went wrong. The cavalry crested the ridge, and their lieutenant, a sharp-faced man Nora recognized as Elias Pike, saw the Apache heading into her barn. "They're attacking the Keene ranch," he shouted. "Open fire!" "No!" Nora screamed, but her voice was lost in the storm and gunfire. Bullets whined through the rain. One of the Apache boys cried out, clutching his shoulder. The horses screamed, and then disaster. A lantern in the barn. probably knocked over by a spooked horse, sent flames licking up the old wood despite the rain. The Apache scattered, trying to protect their wounded. Nora ran toward the barn, thinking only of her stored grain, her winter supplies. The last photograph of Patrick tucked in a box in the loft. The lead Apache rider appeared from nowhere, grabbing her around the waist and hauling her back as a beam crashed down where she'd been standing. "Let me go," she fought him, but his grip was iron. "You'll die for nothing," he said close to her ear. "Let it burn." Through the smoke and rain, she saw Lieutenant Pike organizing his men, heard him shouting about rescuing Mrs. Keene from the savages. The Apache had regrouped by the corral. The wounded boy supported between two others. "They'll say we burned it," the man holding her said, and she heard bitter experience in his voice. "They'll say we attacked you." Nora's mind raced. Pike had never liked her, had made it clear he thought a woman alone was an affront to natural order. He'd offered to protect her more than once, always with strings attached she had no intention of accepting. Now he had his excuse. "There's a trail," she found herself saying. "Behind the rocks, leads to Hidden Spring Canyon." The Apache looked at her with surprise. "Why?" "Because I know a setup when I see one." She pulled free of his grip, grabbed her rifle and the saddlebags she kept ready by the door. "And because I'd rather take my chances with you than explain to Lieutenant Pike how my barn mysteriously caught fire." He studied her for a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. Lightning illuminated his face again, and she saw he was making calculations of his own. Then he nodded. "I am Samuel Redhawk," he said. "You have my word no harm will come to you." "Nora Keene," she replied. "And I'll hold you to that." They ran together through the storm toward the corral. Samuel whistled sharp and clear, and his paint horse came to him like a dog. He swung up and reached down for her. After a moment's hesitation, her last chance to choose the familiar over the unknown Nora took his hand. Pike's shouts followed them into the night, but they were already flying across the desert, the storm at their backs and an uncertain future ahead. As they rode, Nora looked back once at her burning barn, orange flames defying the rain, everything she'd built, everything that tied her to her old life, turning to ash and smoke. But she was alive, and despite everything, the danger, the madness of riding into the night with Apache strangers, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Patrick died. Not happiness, exactly, but possibility, the feeling that her story wasn't over yet. The storm raged on, washing away their tracks, carrying them toward whatever fate awaited in the hidden canyons of the Arizona Territory. And Eleanor Keene, proper widow and respectable landowner, left her old life burning behind her, riding into the darkness with a man whose protection might be her salvation or her doom. Thunder crashed one final time, and the rain began to slacken. Somewhere ahead lay Hidden Spring Canyon and temporary safety, but Nora knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd already lost everything once, that there would be no easy way back from the choice she'd made tonight. The die was cast. Now all that remained was to see where it would land. Hidden Spring Canyon lived up to its name. After riding through the night, they'd reached a narrow cleft in the rocks that opened into a sheltered valley with a clear spring bubbling from the stones. By dawn's first light, Nora saw the Apache had made camp here before fire rings dotted the sandy ground, and brush shelters stood ready for use. She slid from Samuel's horse on legs gone numb from riding, trying not to show how her hands shook. Everything she owned was ash now, save for the rifle on her back and the meager supplies in her saddlebags. The reality of what she'd done crashed over her like a cold wave. "You need rest," Samuel said, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. Up close in daylight, she could see the exhaustion etched in his own features, the way his buckskin shirt was torn at the shoulder. "I need answers," Nora replied, pulling away. "Starting with who you really are and why Pike was chasing you." Before Samuel could respond, the older woman Nora had noticed earlier approached. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept over Nora. "This is the white woman who helped us," she asked Samuel in accented English. "This is Mrs. Keene," Samuel said carefully. "Nora, this is Mary Crowfeather, our medicine keeper." Mary studied Nora like she was reading sign in sand. "You lost your home for us. Why?" "I lost my home because Pike burned it," Nora said firmly. "The why doesn't matter now." A ghost of approval crossed Mary's weathered face. "Come, you need food." The camp came alive as the sun climbed higher. Nora counted 12 Apache and all men, women, and 3 children, including the boy who'd been wounded. He sat propped against a rock while Mary tended his shoulder, trying to look brave despite the pain in his young face. "That's Thomas," Samuel said, following her gaze. "My sister's son. The bullet went through clean, he'll heal." "How old is he?" 14 winters. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Old enough to be shot at for the crime of being Apache." Nora watched as a Mexican woman she hadn't noticed before helped Mary with the wounded boy. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, speaking a mixture of Spanish and Apache that somehow everyone seemed to understand. "That's Luz Ortega," Samuel explained. "She's been with us 3 years now, since her husband was killed by bandits. We're not all Apache here, Mrs. Keene. We're just people trying to survive." The camp's daily rhythm unfolded around her. Women scraped hides and ground corn on stone medities. Men checked weapons and discussed something in low, urgent tones. The children, after the initial wariness, began playing a game with marked stones near the spring. Nora found herself drawn into the work without quite deciding to be. When she saw Luz struggling with a heavy water jar, she moved to help. When the women began preparing the noon meal, she wordlessly joined them, her ranch-roughened hands as capable as any of theirs. "You work like someone who knows hunger," Mary observed, watching Nora shape corn cakes with practiced motions. "My family knew lean times in Ireland," Nora admitted, "before we came to America." "Ah," Mary nodded as if this explained everything. "Hunger is a teacher that crosses all borders." As they worked, Nora caught fragments of conversation. The men were arguing about something she heard Samuel's name mentioned several times, not always kindly. A younger warrior with a scarred face seemed particularly upset, gesturing sharply toward where Nora sat. "That's James Hollowhorn," Luz whispered, following Nora's gaze. "He thinks Samuel made a mistake bringing you here." "Maybe he did," Nora said quietly. Luz shrugged. "Maybe, but Mary says the spirits sometimes send help in unexpected forms. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you make better corn cakes than James, so I vote you stay." Despite everything, Nora found herself almost smiling back. The peace shattered just after noon. One of the scouts came riding hard into camp, his horse lathered with sweat. He spoke rapidly in Apache, but Nora didn't need translation. The alarm in his voice was universal. Samuel strode over to where the women sat. "Soldiers," he said tersely. "Still searching. We need to move deeper into the mountains." "I'm slowing you down," Nora said, getting to her feet. "Give me a horse and directions to the nearest town." "To what end?" Samuel interrupted. "So Pike can arrest you for aiding savages, so he can force you to testify that we attacked your ranch." Nora hadn't thought that far ahead. The truth of it hit her like a slap. "She comes with us," Mary said with quiet authority. "The decision is made." James protested loudly in Apache, but Mary silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "The woman chose to help us. We don't abandon those who show courage. Even if they're white, that's their way, not ours." The camp broke with practiced efficiency. Shelters came down, fire pits were scattered, and within minutes it looked as if no one had been there at all. Nora found herself mounted on a sturdy mare, her few possessions tied behind the saddle. They climbed higher into the Chiricahua Mountains. following trails that seemed to exist more in the Apache's memory than in any visible path. The terrain grew rougher, the air thinner. Nora's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she bit back any complaint. She'd chosen this path, she'd ride it without whimpering. At a rest stop near a trickling stream, young Thomas approached her shyly. His wounded arm was bound in a sling, but he moved with the resilience of youth. "My uncle says you're a good shot," he said in careful English. "He saw you hold the rifle steady in the storm." "My husband taught me," Nora replied. "Said a woman alone needed to know how to defend herself." Thomas nodded solemnly. "My mother knew how to shoot too. The soldiers killed her anyway." The simple statement hit Nora like a physical blow. She looked at this boy barely older than some of her students when she'd taught school back in Illinois and saw the weight he carried. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing how inadequate the words were. Thomas shrugged with one shoulder, a gesture that tried to be casual but failed. "Uncle Samuel says living well is the best revenge. But sometimes I think James is right, fighting is better than running." "Sometimes fighting just gets you killed," Nora said gently. "Your uncle seems like a man who knows when to do which." "He's different since Mother died," Thomas said quietly. "More careful. James says he's gone soft, but I think—" He trailed off, searching for words. "I think he's just tired of burying people." Before Nora could respond, Samuel appeared. "We need to keep moving. Thomas, go help with the pack horses." The boy scampered off, leaving them alone by the stream. "He likes you," Samuel observed. "That's rare. He hasn't trusted any whites since soldiers killed his mother." Samuel's face went carefully blank. "Among other things," he studied her for a moment, "you're not what I expected, Mrs. Keene." "What did you expect?" "Fear, demands, complaints about the hardships." He gestured at the steep trail ahead. "Not this quiet acceptance. I've buried a husband. Mr. Red Hawk," Nora said simply. "I've worked land that didn't want to be worked, survived winters with more cold than food. Your mountains don't scare me." She paused. "You're Lieutenant Pike, on the other hand." "He's not my lieutenant," Samuel said sharply. Then, more quietly, "But yes, he should scare you. He's killed more Apache than any other officer at Fort Buchanan, and he's never let law or conscience slow him down." They reached a higher camp as the sun set a protected valley with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. As the others set up for the night, Nora noticed how everyone had specific roles, how efficiently they worked together. This wasn't just a band of refugees, it was a community. After the evening meal, she found herself sitting near the fire with the women. Mary was teaching Luce some healing songs, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. The children had fallen asleep in a pile like puppies, exhausted from the day's travel. "You're thinking heavy thoughts," Mary observed, not pausing in her song. "I'm thinking I don't belong here," Nora admitted. "Belonging isn't about blood," Mary said. "It's about choice. Today you chose. Tomorrow you'll choose again. That's all any of us do." James stalked by, still radiating disapproval. He said something sharp to Samuel in Apache, gesturing toward Nora. Samuel replied calmly, but James's voice rose, and suddenly they were facing each other like two bulls about to charge. "Enough," Mary commanded in English, clearly wanting Nora to understand. "James Hollowhorn, you shame yourself. This woman lost everything to help us, and you repay her with suspicion." "She's white," James spat. "They always betray us in the end." "And you're a fool," Mary shot back. "Judge people by their actions, not their skin, or you're no better than the soldiers who hunt us." James stormed off into the darkness. Samuel started to follow, but Mary stopped him with a gesture. "Let him cool his head," she advised. "He'll come around or he won't, but pushing will only make him dig in deeper." As the fire burned low, people drifted to their sleeping places. Nora had been given a small shelter slightly apart from the others, close enough for protection but respecting her privacy. She lay on the blanket Luce had provided, staring up at stars sharper than any she'd seen from her ranch. Everything had changed in one night. Yesterday she'd been Eleanor Keene, respectable widow trying to scratch a living from desert soil. Tonight she was a refugee, a woman without a home, without a clear future, thrown in with people she'd been taught to fear. But as she listened to the night sounds of the camp, someone singing softly to a restless child, the low murmur of the night guards, the stamp and blow of horses, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not regret, but a strange sense of possibility. For 3 years, she'd merely survived, going through the motions of life without really living. Now, thrown into danger and uncertainty, she felt more alive than she had since Patrick's death. It made no sense. But then, nothing about the last day had made sense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges Pike wouldn't give up easily. And James's hostility was just the beginning of the obstacles she'd face. But tonight, under stars that didn't care about the color of her skin or the choices that had brought her here, Nora Keene slept better than she had in months. Change, she was learning, sometimes came like a storm in the night, sudden, violent, washing away everything you thought you knew, but after every storm, the desert bloomed. The third day brought them to the edge of everything, where the mountains gave way to a vast expanse of grassland. And beyond that, the Gila River cutting through the landscape like a brown snake. They'd have to cross open ground to reach the next safe haven, and everyone knew it. Samuel studied the terrain through a brass telescope, his face grim. The river's running high from the storms. It'll be dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous, James muttered, still nursing his grudge like a wounded limb. Nora had learned to read the signs of trouble in their group, the way conversations stopped when soldiers were mentioned, how hands moved instinctively to weapons at distant sounds. Now she saw new tension in the set of Samuel's shoulders. "There's a ferry crossing 10 miles downstream," Luce suggested. "My husband and I used it once." "Too risky," Samuel said. "Pike will have men watching every established crossing." He lowered the telescope. "We go straight across tonight after moonset." Mary clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "The river spirits are angry from the storm. Listen, you can hear them, even from their high vantage." Nora could indeed hear the river's roar. It sounded hungry. They spent the day preparing. Belongings were wrapped in oiled cloth, weapons secured high on bodies. Mary led prayers in Apache, her voice rising and falling like the wind. Some of the men constructed rough rafts from driftwood and rope, lashing them tight with practiced hands. Nora watched it all with growing unease. She'd forded streams on the ranch, but this was different, a real river, swollen with storm runoff, carrying the weight of mountains in its current. "You know how to swim?" Samuel asked, appearing beside her as the sun began its descent. There was a pond back in Illinois. This won't be like any pond." He handed her a coil of rope. "Tie this around your waist. If you go under, we'll pull you out." "And if you go under?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Then I suppose we'll both be in trouble." As darkness fell, they moved down from the heights in single file, the children carried by the strongest riders. The sound of the river grew louder, angrier. When they finally reached its banks, Nora's heart sank. In the dim starlight, she could see the water churning past, carrying debris, whole trees, sometimes like toys. "Mother of God," she breathed, forgetting she wasn't alone. "Your God or ours," Mary said beside her. "We'll need them all tonight." They crossed in groups. The best swimmers went first, carrying ropes to establish lines across the torrent. Nora watched, her mouth dry, as the first man entered the water and was immediately swept sideways, fighting the current with powerful strokes. For heart-stopping moments, he disappeared. Then his head broke the surface downstream, still swimming hard. Eventually, he made the far bank and secured the rope. More lines were established, creating a web of support across the water. The rafts were launched with supplies, and those who couldn't swim, mainly elders and the youngest children. One raft spun wildly in the current before the men manning it got control, poling frantically for the far shore. "Your turn," Samuel said. Nora's group consisted of herself, Samuel, young Thomas, who insisted he was strong enough despite his wounded arm, and two women with their children. They would wade and swim, using the ropes for guidance. The water hit like a freezing fist. Nora gasped, nearly losing her footing immediately. The current was stronger than anything she'd imagined, trying to rip her legs out from under her, to spin her away into the darkness. She gripped the guide rope with both hands, forcing herself forward step by step. Beside her, one of the women cried out. Her daughter, a girl of maybe 6, had slipped from her back. Without thinking, Nora lunged for the child, catching a handful of dress as the current tried to claim her. For a moment, they both went under, the world becoming a chaos of black water and burning lungs. Then strong hands hauled them up Samuel, fighting to keep all three of them connected to the rope. "Hold her tight!" he shouted over the river's roar. Nora wrapped one arm around the child, feeling small hands grip her neck with desperate strength. Each step was a battle, the river trying every trick to dislodge them. Debris struck her legs' branches, sometimes larger things she didn't want to identify. The far shore seemed impossibly distant. Then, suddenly, hands were pulling them up onto dry ground. Nora collapsed on the sand, still clutching the child, both of them coughing up river water. The girl's mother fell beside them, sobbing prayers in a mixture of Apache and Spanish. "That was brave," Thomas said, his young face full of admiration. "Stupid, but brave." "Story of my life, kid," Nora managed between coughs. But they weren't done. A cry went up from the crossers still in the water. One of the rafts had broken free, spinning out of control downstream. An elderly woman and 2 children clung to it, their screams barely audible over the river's voice. Without hesitation, Samuel and 2 other men plunged back in, swimming hard at an angle to intercept the runaway raft. Nora found herself on her feet, running along the bank with others, everyone searching for a place where the raft might come close enough to shore. "There!" Luce pointed to a bend where the current swung near a fallen tree, extending into the water. They reached it just as the raft came spinning around the curve. Samuel had managed to grab one corner, fighting to steer it towards shore while the other men pushed from behind. The fallen tree was their only chance. "Form a chain," Mary commanded. They linked hands, Nora anchoring herself against a boulder while others extended into the shallows. The raft struck the tree with a crack of wood, tilting dangerously. The elderly woman lost her grip, sliding toward the water. But James, who'd shown Nora nothing but hostility, lunged forward and caught her, hauling her bodily onto the tree trunk. One by one, they passed the survivors to shore. When Samuel finally staggered out of the water, he could barely stand. Without thinking, Nora moved to support him, taking his weight against her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, and she knew he meant for more than just the physical support. They couldn't rest. Dawn was coming, and the crossing had taken longer than planned. Wet, exhausted, they pushed on into the grasslands, seeking cover before full daylight exposed them on the open plain. It was mid-morning when the scouts brought bad news. Riders behind them, not soldiers, but something perhaps worse. "Apache scouts," Samuel said grimly, studying the distant dust through his telescope. "Working for the army, they'll track us better than any white soldier." "One of them is William Two Horses," another man added. "I recognize his roan stallion." The name sent a ripple of unease through the group. Nora didn't need to ask why the betrayal of their own kind cut deeper than any enemy action. They changed direction, heading for a cluster of buttes that offered better defensive positions. But they were tired, the children struggling, some of the elders barely able to stay mounted. The pace was killing them. "We need to rest," Mary said firmly. The people can't go on like this. If we stop, they catch us, James argued. Then maybe it's time to stop running, Samuel said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at him. I'm tired of it, he continued, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. We run, they chase, we hide, they find us. When does it end? When we're all dead, James said bitterly. Or when we find another way. Samuel looked at Nora. You lived among them. Is there any law? Any person who might listen to truth instead of Pike's lies? Nora thought carefully before answering. There's a federal judge in Tucson, Judge Morrison. He's known for being fair, even to Mexicans and Indians, but getting to him past Pike would be impossible, James finished. This is foolish talk. But Mary was nodding slowly. Not impossible. Difficult, dangerous, but not impossible. They made camp in the lee of the buttes, posting guards while the others tried to rest. Nora found herself tending the children, checking cuts and bruises from the crossing. The little girl she'd saved, Rosa, she'd learned wouldn't leave her side, clutching Nora's skirt with one small hand. She says you have river magic, Luce translated with a smile, that you fought the water spirit and won. I just grabbed her dress, Nora protested. To her, that's magic enough. As the sun reached its zenith, painting the grasslands gold, Samuel found Nora sitting apart, cleaning her rifle, a ritual that calmed her when nothing else would. I need to ask you something, he said, settling beside her with the natural grace she'd come to admire. If we could get to this judge, would you speak for us? Tell what really happened at your ranch. Of course. She didn't hesitate. But Pike has probably already spread his version. A white woman's word against an officer's, might not be believed. Samuel finished. I know. But Mary's right, we need to try something different. This running and hiding, it's killing us slowly. Better to face their law and take our chances than watch our children grow up in fear. Nora reassembled her rifle with practiced movements, thinking, there might be a way. Pike's not as clever as he thinks. If he's claiming you attacked my ranch, burned it down there should be evidence that doesn't match his story. The fire started in the barn, not the house. The bullet holes will show the soldiers fired first. And there's something else. She reached into her saddlebag, pulling out a small leather journal. I keep records. Everything that happens on the ranch, visitors, weather, problems, including Pike's visits and what he said about forcing me off the land if I didn't accept his protection. Samuel's eyes lit up. You have proof of his intentions. Maybe, if it's enough, she shrugged. We won't know unless we try. A shout from one of the guards interrupted them. Dust was rising from the south, now 2 more riders, moving to cut off their escape routes. They're boxing us in, James said, his scarred face grim. Just like they did to Geronimo's band at Skeleton Canyon. But Samuel was studying the terrain with new purpose. Maybe that's what we want them to do. Have you lost your mind? James demanded. Listen. Samuel gathered the leaders around him. If we run, they catch us tired and scattered. But if we choose the ground, prepare our defense. Make them come to us, and if misses, Keene can get word to this judge about what's really happening. It was a desperate plan, full of holes and maybes. But as Nora looked around at the exhausted faces, at Rosa still clutching her skirt, at Thomas trying to be brave despite his fear, at Mary's weathered dignity, she knew they had to try. I'll need a fast horse and someone who knows the way to Tucson, she said. You'll have both, Samuel promised. Then, to the others. We make our stand here, not to fight to the death, but to buy time for the truth to reach someone who might listen. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they prepared. Not for running this time, but for standing their ground. It went against every instinct that had kept them alive. But sometimes, Nora reflected, the bravest thing you could do was stop running and face what chased you. The dust clouds grew closer, Soon, very soon, they would find out if courage and truth were enough against bullets and lies. But for now, in this moment between decision and consequence, Nora felt the same clarity she'd experienced that night in the storm. She'd crossed her river. Now it was time to see what waited on the other shore. The cave was a blessing they hadn't expected to find deep enough to shelter everyone, with a narrow entrance that could be defended and a spring trickling through the back chambers. As night fell and rain began to patter outside, they moved the wounded and elderly inside while the fighters took positions among the rocks. Nora had volunteered to ride for Tucson at first light, but Samuel had overruled her. "They'll be watching for you specifically. Pike needs you to complete his story." Instead, Luce would go with an older Apache man named Joseph Crow Dog, who knew every hidden trail between here and the city. They would carry Nora's journal and a letter she'd written explaining the truth. Now, in the relative safety of the cave, and strange calm settled over the group, they'd made their choice to stand and face whatever came. The die was cast, as Patrick used to say when he'd made a decision he couldn't take back. Nora sat near the cave mouth, watching the rain turn the desert into a shifting silver curtain. The temperature had dropped with the storm, and she pulled her blanket tighter. Behind her, she could hear Mary singing softly to the children, the ancient melodies echoing off stone walls. "You should rest," Samuel said, appearing from the darkness. He'd been checking the sentries, making sure everyone understood their positions for when Pike's forces arrived. "Can't sleep," Nora admitted. "Keep thinking about what happens tomorrow." He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool air. "Tomorrow will take care of itself. It's tonight I'm thinking about." There was something different in his voice, a weight that made her turn to look at him. In the dim light from the cave's fire, his face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "What about tonight?" she asked softly. "Tonight might be all we have," he said simply. "I've been thinking about what you did at the river. You didn't have to save Rosa. You could have let her go, saved yourself the risk." "Anyone would have—" "No." His voice was firm but gentle. "Not anyone. You made a choice. Just like you made a choice that night at your ranch. You keep choosing to help us, even though we've brought you nothing but trouble." "You saved my life," Nora reminded him, "from the fire. And you've saved us more than once since then. With your courage, your wisdom, your strength." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "My mother used to tell me that the spirits put people in our path for a reason. I didn't believe her thought it was just stories to comfort a boy who didn't fit in either world. But now, the rain intensified, creating a curtain of sound that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. Nora found herself acutely aware of every detail, the way his hair, still damp from the rain, fell across his shoulder, the careful strength in his hands, the way he smelled of leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Now," she prompted when he didn't continue. Now I think maybe she was right. He turned to face her fully. "Eleanor Keene, you've turned my world inside out in a handful of days. I should be thinking only of my people, of the fight tomorrow, but instead, I find myself thinking of you." Nora's heart was thundering so loud she was sure he must hear it. "Samuel!" "I know," he said quickly. "I know all the reasons this is impossible. You're white. I'm Apache. Your world would never accept it. My people, some of them already think I'm too much like my mother, too willing to see good in whites. But tonight, with the rain and the darkness and tomorrow uncertain..." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with fingertips calloused from years of weapons and rains. "Tonight I just want to be a man talking to a woman, without the weight of our people's history between us." Nora leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. "We're not our people's," she whispered. "We're just us." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "If only it were that simple." "It can be," Nora said, surprising herself with her boldness. In here, tonight. It can be exactly that simple." They moved deeper into the cave, finding a small alcove away from the others. The sound of rain mixed with the distant echo of Mary's singing, creating a cocoon of sound around them. Samuel spread his blanket on the sandy floor, then helped Nora sit, his hands lingering on her arms. "I need you to know," he said, his voice low and serious. "I respect you too much to... I would never..." "I know," Nora said, touched by his concern. "I trust you, Samuel." He pulled her against him then, her back to his chest, wrapping his blanket around them both. For a long moment they just sat that way, listening to the storm, feeling the simple human comfort of another's warmth. "Tell me about your mother," Nora said eventually. "How did she come to be with the Apache?" Samuel's arms tightened slightly around her. "She was taken during a raid when she was 15. My father's first wife had died in childbirth. And by our custom, he could have sold her to the Mexicans or kept her as a slave, but he saw something in her, a strength, a fire. He married her properly, made her his wife in all ways." "Did she ever try to go back?" "Once, when I was small. She took me to a white settlement, tried to find her family, but they looked at her at us with such disgust. Her own brother called me an abomination, said she was dead to them the moment she lay with savages." His voice carried old pain. "She never tried again." Nora turned in his arms to face him. "I'm sorry." "She found happiness eventually. My father was a good man, treated her well. She taught me English, taught me that there was good in both worlds even if neither wanted to claim us." He touched her face again, wonder in his expression. "I think she would have liked you. Because I'm white. Because you're brave. Because you see people, not just skin." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "Because you make me believe that maybe the world could be different." The firelight from the main cave barely reached them here, but Nora could see his eyes, dark and intense, fixed on hers. "Samuel?" she breathed, not sure what she was asking. "I'll be gentle," he murmured, echoing a promise she didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. "I'll always be gentle with you." When he kissed her, it was indeed gentle, a question more than a statement, asking permission with every soft press of his lips. Nora answered by winding her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, trying to pour everything she couldn't say into this one perfect moment. They broke apart when thunder crashed overhead, both breathing hard. Samuel rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and breakable. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Everything's already changed," Nora replied. "My home is gone. I'm sheltering in a cave with people I was taught to fear, facing a battle tomorrow that we might not survive. What's one more impossible thing?" He laughed then, soft and real. "When you put it that way..." They talked through the night, sharing stories in the darkness. He told her about learning to track from his uncle, about the first time he killed a deer and cried because its eyes reminded him of his mother's gentleness. She told him about the voyage from Ireland, about meeting Patrick at a church social and knowing within minutes that she'd marry him, about the crushing loneliness of the past 3 years. "I wasn't living," she admitted. "Just going through the motions, one day to the next, until that night in the storm when everything went to hell. Or when everything started." Samuel suggested. They dozed fitfully as the storm passed, wrapped in each other and their blankets. Nora woke once to find Samuel watching her, his expression soft with something that made her heart ache. "What?" she whispered. "Memorizing," he said simply. "In case..." "Don't!" She pressed her fingers to his lips. "We're going to get through tomorrow. Luce will reach the judge. The truth will come out. And we'll find a way." "Your certainty is either inspiring or terrifying," he said against her fingers. "I haven't decided which..." "Be inspired," she advised. "It's better for both of us." As dawn approached, bringing with it the need to face reality, they reluctantly untangled themselves. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. From the cave mouth, they could see Pike's forces arranged on the plain below: soldiers, Apache scouts, and what looked like civilian volunteers, all waiting for enough light to attack. "So many," Nora breathed. "He wants to make sure this time," Samuel said grimly. "No survivors to tell a different story." But as the sun rose higher, something unexpected happened. A dust cloud appeared from the East Riders, approaching fast, but not in military formation. "Who?" James began, then stopped, staring. The lead rider carried a flag of truce. Behind him rode a mixed group: buffalo soldiers, Mexican vaqueros, even what looked like a Chinese merchant Nora recognized from town. And at their head, tall and imposing even at a distance, rode Judge Morrison himself. "How?" Mary asked, voicing what they all wondered. Then Nora saw her loose, riding near the judge, her face triumphant even from here. Somehow, impossibly, she'd not only reached Tucson in the night, but convinced these people to ride back with her. Pike's ordered formation began to shift uneasily as the judge's party approached. Through Samuel's telescope, Nora could see the lieutenant's face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "He didn't expect witnesses," Samuel said with satisfaction. "Especially not a federal judge." As the two groups converged on the plain below, Samuel squeezed Nora's hand. "Ready to tell your truth?" She squeezed back, feeling the warmth of his skin, the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "Ready?" They began their descent from the cave, toward whatever justice awaited on the plain below. But no matter what happened next, Nora knew that last night in the cave, that gentle space they'd carved out between two worlds, would stay with her forever. Sometimes the most passionate fires burned quiet and deep, warming you from the inside out. And sometimes being gentle was the bravest thing of all. The meeting on the plain below the cave would be remembered in territorial history as the standoff at Dead Horse Canyon, though no horses died that day. And what happened was less a standoff than a careful dance of law, truth, and barely contained violence. Judge Morrison, a tall man with silver temples and eyes like winter steel, positioned himself exactly between Pike's forces and the cave where the Apache waited. His mixed group of witnesses spread out behind him, their very presence a challenge to Pike's narrative of savage raiders and helpless white victims. "Lieutenant Pike," the judge's voice carried across the morning air, "I received some disturbing information in the night, something about an attack on the Keene Ranch that doesn't quite match your official report." Pike's face flushed red. "Your Honor, these savages have obviously deceived you. Mrs. Keene is their captive." "Then let's ask Mrs. Keene herself, shall we?" Morrison turned toward the cave. "Mrs. Keene, if you can hear me, you have my word as a federal judge that you may speak freely without fear of reprisal." Nora descended with Samuel and the other leaders, her chin high despite her travel-worn appearance. She'd cleaned herself as best she could, braided her hair properly, and wore her most respectable dress from her saddlebags. She looked like what she was, a frontier woman who'd been through hell but hadn't broken. "Judge Morrison," she said clearly as she approached, "I'm no captive. I'm here of my own free will." "She's been corrupted," Pike snarled. "These heathens have—" "Lieutenant," Morrison's voice cracked like a whip, "you'll have your chance to speak. Mrs. Keene, please tell us what happened at your ranch." Nora told the story simply, without embellishment. The storm, the Apache seeking shelter, Pike's men opening fire, the barn burning. She produced her journal, showing entries dating back months that documented Pike's harassment and threats. "He wanted my land," she said. "When I wouldn't sell or accept his protection, he saw an opportunity to force me out and blame it on the Apache." "Lies." Pike's hand went to his sidearm. But the buffalo soldiers behind Morrison shifted meaningfully. "Your Honor, this woman has clearly lost her mind. Living among savages." "I've lost my home," Nora interrupted. "My livelihood, everything I worked for, but my mind is quite sound. Lieutenant, sound enough to recognize a land grab when I see one." Morrison examined the journal, his face growing stonier with each entry. "These are serious accusations. Mrs. Keene, Lieutenant Pike, how do you respond?" But Pike had made a fatal error. He looked toward the crowd of civilian volunteers, seeking someone specific. Morrison caught the glance and followed it to a well-dressed man trying to edge backward through the crowd. "Mr. Silas Crane," Morrison called out. "Don't leave just yet. I believe your name appears frequently in Mrs. Keene's journal. Something about railway rights of way." The game was up, and Pike knew it. His face contorted with rage as he realized how thoroughly his plan had unraveled. But he wasn't done yet. "Even if there were irregularities," he said, "these Apache have killed soldiers, stolen horses, terrorized settlements." "Which settlements?" Morrison asked mildly. "Which soldiers? I've checked the records. Lieutenant, the only violence reported in this area recently is what happened at the Keene Ranch." "They're savages." Pike's control snapped completely. "They don't belong here. This is white man's land, won by right of conquest and civilization." "Actually," a new voice interjected, one of the buffalo soldiers, a sergeant with gray in his beard. "This particular stretch belongs to whoever holds legal title, and last I checked, that wasn't determined by skin color." What happened next would be debated in saloons and courtrooms for years. Pike, seeing his career and schemes crumbling, made a desperate play. He shouted to his Apache scouts, particularly to William Two Horses, the tracker who'd led them here. "Tell them," Pike commanded. "Tell them about the raids, the attacks you've witnessed." But William Two Horses, who'd been silent throughout the confrontation, slowly shook his head. "I've witnessed nothing but people trying to survive. Lieutenant, people you've hunted like animals for wanting to live free." The betrayal, or perhaps the refusal to betray, broke something in Pike. He drew his pistol, aiming not at the judge or the soldiers, but at Samuel. "If the law won't deal with savages, I will." 3 things happened simultaneously. Nora threw herself sideways, knocking Samuel off balance. James, who'd been coiled like a spring, launched himself at Pike, and Judge Morrison's voice thundered across the canyon, "Stand down or be shot where you stand." Pike's shot went wild, striking rock and sending chips flying. James hit him a second later, bearing him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, fighting for the gun, while soldiers from both sides shouted and aimed weapons at each other. "Stop!" It was Mary's voice, carrying an authority that somehow cut through the chaos. She walked forward, unarmed, placing herself between the two groups. "No more blood. Haven't we spilled enough?" The fighting stopped. James had Pike pinned. The lieutenant's gun kicked away into the dirt. Slowly, carefully, weapons were lowered on both sides. "Sergeant," Morrison addressed the senior soldier present, "place Lieutenant Pike under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to defraud, and conduct unbecoming an officer." "You can't," Pike struggled against James's grip. "I'm acting under military authority." "Your authority ended when you drew a weapon on civilians in my presence," Morrison said coldly. "Take him." As Pike was hauled away, still ranting about savages and civilization, Morrison turned to address both groups. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Mr. Crane, you'll be returning to Tucson with me to discuss your land schemes with the federal prosecutor. The Apache band, led by Mr. Red Hawk, has committed no crimes that I can see, and they're free to go where they please. Mrs. Keene, you'll need to file a formal claim for damages regarding your property." "Where will they go?" one of the civilian volunteers asked nervously. "The Apache, I mean—" Samuel stepped forward, Away from here. Find somewhere else to try and live in peace. Until the next pike comes along. Actually, Morrison said thoughtfully, I might have another suggestion. There's a new settlement being established near the New Mexico border. Mixed community Apache, Mexican, Anglo, even some Chinese merchants. They're looking for people who can work together regardless of background, could use experienced horsemen and... He glanced at Nora. People who understand both worlds. A reservation? James asked suspiciously. A town, Morrison corrected. With proper deeds and legal standing. Not perfect, but better than running. The Apache leaders withdrew to discuss this. Nora stood awkwardly between both groups, belonging fully to neither. She caught Luz's eye. The woman who'd ridden through the night gave her a knowing smile. When the Apache returned, it was Mary who spoke. We'll send representatives to see this town. If it's as you say, perhaps some of us will try. And Mrs. Keene, Morrison asked, what will you do? Before Nora could answer, Samuel spoke. She rides with us. She's proven herself a friend to the Apache. She has a place with our band for as long as she wants it. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Some of the volunteers muttered, but after what they'd witnessed, none seemed eager to challenge the decision. As the various groups began to disperse, Morrison's party taking Pike and Crane back to Tucson, the soldiers returning to Fort Buchanan with a very different report than expected, Nora found herself standing with Samuel on the same spot where violence had nearly erupted. You didn't have to speak for me, she said quietly. Did you want me to stay silent? She looked up at him. This man who'd upended her life in a handful of days. No, this isn't how I saw my life going. The spirits laugh at our plans, he said, taking her hand. My mother used to say that too. Young Thomas ran up, his wounded arm still in a sling, but his face bright with relief. Uncle, does this mean we don't have to fight? Today we don't have to fight, Samuel confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair. Tomorrow. We'll see what tomorrow brings. As they prepared to leave Dead Horse Canyon, Nora took one last look at the place that had nearly become a battleground. The sun was high now, burning off the last of the storm's moisture, revealing a landscape that was harsh but somehow beautiful in its severity. Regrets? Samuel asked, coming to stand beside her. No. She was surprised to find she meant it. My old life ended when that barn burned. Maybe it needed to. I was just existing, not living. And now? She turned to face him. This complicated man who'd shown her there were different ways to be strong, different definitions of civilization. Now I'm terrified, she admitted. I don't know what comes next, where I fit, how this can possibly work. But, he prompted, reading something in her face. But I'm also more alive than I've been in years. She reached up to touch the scar through his eyebrow, a gesture that already felt natural. That has to count for something. He caught her hand, pressed it to his cheek. It counts for everything. They rode out of Dead Horse Canyon that afternoon, Apache, Mexican, and one displaced Irish woman, bound together by circumstance and choice. Behind them lay the wreckage of Pike's schemes and the old rigid boundaries that said people like them couldn't make common cause. Ahead lay uncertainty, the promised settlement that might or might not accept them. The challenge of building something new from the ashes of the old. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this path they'd chosen would be easy. But as they rode through country painted gold by the afternoon sun, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced since standing at the rail of the ship that brought her to America all those years ago. Hope. Not the naive hope of youth, but the tested hope of someone who'd lost everything and discovered they could still choose to begin again. The mountain passage where violence had been avoided would gain many names over the years. Dead Horse Canyon, Justice Draw, the place where truth spoke. But for Nora, riding between Samuel and young Thomas, listening to Mary's strong voice leading the band in a traveling song, it would always be the place where her new life truly began. The future was uncertain, the path unclear, But she was no longer alone, no longer just surviving from one empty day to the next. And sometimes, in the harsh beauty of the frontier, that was victory enough. The abandoned trapper's cabin sat in a hidden valley 3 days' ride from Dead Horse Canyon, sheltered by pines and fed by a spring that ran clear even in the driest months. When Samuel first led Nora through the narrow defile that opened into their private haven, she felt like they'd stepped out of the world entirely. "It's perfect," she breathed, taking in the solid log walls, the stone chimney, the meadow that could support a small garden. "It needs work," Samuel said modestly, but she could see his pleasure at her reaction. "The roof leaks and pack rats have been at the stores, but the bones are good." They'd chosen separation from the main band after much discussion. Many of the Apache had decided to investigate Judge Morrison's settlement, but Samuel felt the pull of solitude and the desire to build something with Nora away from watching eyes and wagging tongues. "Two worlds are hard enough to bridge without an audience," he'd told Mary when seeking her blessing. The medicine woman had studied them both with knowing eyes. "The path you choose won't be easy. Your children will belong to neither world fully, or they'll belong to both." Nora had said firmly, "They'll make their own world." Now, as autumn painted the aspens gold, they worked to make the cabin livable before winter. Samuel proved as skilled with hammer and saw as he was with rifle and rope, while Nora attacked the years of grime with fierce determination. Slowly, the cabin transformed from shelter to home. Their days fell into rhythm. Morning meant tending the horses they'd kept from the band's herd, checking Samuel's trap lines, working the small garden plot Nora insisted on despite the lateness of the season. Afternoons brought harder labor chinking logs, patching the roof, building furniture from pine and willow. Evenings were for planning, for sharing stories by the fire, for the quiet intimacy they were still learning to navigate. "You're different here," Nora observed one evening, watching Samuel carve a wooden spoon with patient strokes. "More settled." "I've been running or fighting since I was Thomas's age," he replied. "Maybe I'm just tired." "Or maybe you found something worth staying still for." He looked up at her then, his dark eyes warm in the firelight. "Maybe I have." Their peace shattered on a crystalline morning when the first snow dusted the peaks. Nora was drawing water from the spring when she heard horses approaching too many to be friendly visitors. She ran for the cabin, but Samuel was already outside, rifle in hand. 3 riders emerged from the trees, not soldiers, but harder to categorize drifters, perhaps, or men who lived in the gray spaces between law and lawlessness. Their leader, a gaunt man with pale eyes and a tobacco-stained beard, looked at the cabin with proprietary interest. "Well, well," he drawled. "Seems someone's taken up residence in our winter hideout." "This is our home," Samuel said evenly. "Has been for 2 months now." "That so?" The man spat tobacco juice near Samuel's feet. "Funny thing about squatters' rights, they don't apply to Indians, or Indian lovers." His pale eyes found Nora. "That what you are? Missy an Indian lover?" "I'm Mrs. Red Hawk," Nora said, moving to stand beside Samuel. "And you're trespassing." The man laughed, an ugly sound. "Mrs. Red Hawk, boys! You hear that the lady's gone and married herself a savage?" His hand drifted toward his pistol. "Maybe we should show her what white men think of that kind of—" He never finished the sentence. Samuel's rifle spoke once, sending the man's hat spinning into the dirt. "The next one won't miss," Samuel said quietly. "Take your friends and go. Don't come back." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then the leader slowly reached down to retrieve his hat, his movements careful. "This ain't over, Breed. You and your woman made a mistake settling here." They rode away, but Nora could feel their threat lingering like a bad smell. That night, she and Samuel took turns keeping watch, knowing peace had been shattered. The men came back a week later, but not as expected. Samuel was checking his traps when he heard Nora's scream. He ran harder than he'd ever run, crashing through brush and snow, his heart hammering with fear. He found them at the cabin. Two men held Nora's arms while their leader pawed through their stores, tossing supplies into the dirt. Her face was bruised, her dress torn at the shoulder, but her eyes blazed with fury rather than fear. "Looking for valuables," the leader said conversationally when he saw Samuel. "Figured an Indian lover might have things worth taking. Course, maybe the only valuable thing here is her—" Samuel forced himself to stay calm, to think. 3 men, spread out, all armed. Nora caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. She was hurt but not broken, ready to fight if needed. "Let her go," Samuel said. "Take what you want, but let her go." "Now why would we do that?" The man stepped closer to Nora, running a dirty finger down her cheek. "Pretty thing like this, living with a savage. Maybe she needs reminding what a real man feels like." That's when Nora struck. Her knee came up hard into the leader's groin, doubling him over. She twisted in her captor's grip, stomping on one man's instep while driving her elbow into the other's solar plexus. Samuel moved in the same instant, his rifle butt catching the doubled-over leader in the temple. The man dropped like a felled tree. The other two, struggling with a wildcat Nora, barely saw Samuel coming before he was on them. The fight was brutal but brief. When it ended, 2 of the drifters lay unconscious, and the third knelt in the dirt, blood streaming from his nose. "Please?" he gasped. "We weren't really gonna. Jake just likes to talk big." "Get them out of here," Samuel said coldly. "If I see any of you again, I'll kill you. That's not a threat. It's a promise." As the man struggled to load his unconscious companions onto their horses, Nora sagged against the cabin wall. Samuel was beside her instantly, checking her injuries with a gentle hands. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice shook. "Just bruises and wounded pride." "You fought like a warrior," he said, wonder and worry warring in his voice. "Where did you learn?" 3 older brothers in Dublin. She managed a weak smile. "And a husband who insisted I know how to defend myself. Guess it stuck." But that night, as they lay together listening for returning hoofbeats, they both knew their haven had been found. Word would spread a white woman living with an Apache, isolated and vulnerable. The drifters might not return, but others would. "We could leave," Samuel said into the darkness. "Find somewhere else." "No," Nora's voice was firm. "This is our home. I'm tired of being driven from my home." 2 days later, unexpected help arrived. James appeared at their door, along with 2 other Apache warriors and, surprisingly, Luce with her children. "Mary sent us," James said without preamble. "She had a vision, said you needed family close by." "We're fine," Samuel started, but James cut him off. "No, you're not. Word's already spreading in the settlements about the white woman who fought off 3 men to stay with her Apache man. Some think it's romantic. Others—" he shrugged. "Others are planning to pay you a visit." So they weren't alone anymore. James and the warriors set up a hunting camp within shouting distance. Luce and her children moved into a small cabin they hastily built nearby, close enough for mutual support but far enough for privacy. "A small band," Luce said with satisfaction. "Not Apache, not Mexican, not white, just us." The arrangement proved its worth within the week. A larger group of men arrived, some drifters, some concerned citizens from a nearby settlement. They found not one isolated couple but a community, armed and watchful. After some posturing and threats about unnatural living, they departed without violence. Winter settled over their hidden valley like a blanket. The snows came heavy, isolating them from the outside world. But Nora had never felt less alone. She learned winter crafts from Luce, how to make the most of preserved food, how to keep children entertained when blizzards raged, how to maintain hope through the dark months. And then, on a morning when ice crystals turned the world to diamonds, Nora knew. The nausea she'd attributed to preserved meat, the exhaustion she'd blamed on hard work, the tenderness in her body, it all pointed to one conclusion. She told Samuel by the fire that night, watching emotions chase across his face: wonder, joy, fear, and back to wonder. "A child," he said softly, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "Our child." "Born between worlds," Nora said, echoing Mary's words. "It won't be easy." "Nothing about our life is easy," Samuel replied, "but it's ours." The winter passed in preparation. Samuel carved a cradle with the same patience he brought to all things, decorating it with symbols from both their traditions, Celtic knots intertwined with Apache patterns. Nora sewed tiny clothes, while Luce regaled her with birthing stories that were equal parts reassuring and terrifying. James surprised everyone by becoming protective of Nora, appointing himself guardian of the valley's approaches. "Can't have my cousin born in chaos," he said gruffly when thanked. As spring began to touch the high country, melting snow into rushing streams, Nora felt the first labor pains. The birth was long and difficult, 2 days of struggle that left her weak and Samuel haggard with worry. But when their son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, all the pain faded before the miracle of his existence. "Thomas," Nora said, thinking of Samuel's nephew, of beginnings and continuations. "Thomas Redhawk." "He needs an Apache name, too," Samuel said, cradling his son with infinite care. "Dakea. It means he who bridges." Mary arrived a week later. Having traveled from the New Mexico settlement with her usual perfect timing, she examined the baby with careful hands, pronounced him healthy and strong, then fixed both parents with a stern look. "This child will face challenges you can't imagine," she said. "The world isn't kind to those who don't fit its categories. But he also carries hope, the hope that people can come together, can create something new." She smiled then, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Raise him to be proud of both his bloods. Teach him that home isn't about race or tradition, it's about the people who choose to stand together." As Nora nursed her son in their cabin, built stronger now, defended by chosen family, filled with the mingled scents of sage and lavender, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a burning ranch to a hidden valley. From widowhood to a love she'd never expected. From isolation to a community forged by choice rather than blood. Outside, Samuel and James worked on expanding the garden, their voices carrying on the spring wind, sometimes English, sometimes Apache, often a mixture that would have horrified language purists, but perfectly suited their small, stubborn settlement. "No regrets?" Luce asked, sitting beside her, her own children playing at their feet. Nora looked down at her son, this impossible, perfect child who would grow up knowing both the Lord's Prayer and Apache hunting songs, who would carry 2 worlds in his blood and, God willing, help build a bridge between them. "Not one," she said, and meant it. The settlement of Haven Springs emerged from the New Mexico desert like a mirage, made real adobe buildings the color of sunset. A wooden church with a cross that caught the morning light, and streets where Apache, Mexican, Anglo, and Chinese faces mingled with cautious hope. Nora held 2-year-old Thomas on her hip as their wagon rolled down the main street. The boy pointed excitedly at everything, chattering in his peculiar mixture of English and Apache that only his parents fully understood. "Look, Dakea," Samuel said, using the boy's Apache name. "Your new home." They'd resisted coming for 2 years, content in their mountain valley with their small chosen family. But isolation had its price. Thomas needed other children, education, a chance to know the wider world. And there were practical concerns. Supplies grew harder to obtain, and the threat of random violence never fully disappeared. The final push came from an unexpected source. Judge Morrison himself had ridden to their valley, accompanied by a small escort. "The settlement needs people like you," he'd said simply. "Families who've already proven they can bridge differences. Young Thomas here deserves a chance to grow up in a place where being mixed blood isn't a curse, but a blessing." Now, seeing the town, Nora felt both hope and trepidation. Haven Springs was an experiment. Morrison had explained an attempt to create something new on the frontier, where law mattered more than blood and cooperation more than conquest. Their assigned plot sat at the town's edge, 5 acres with water rights and a half-built adobe house. James and his family had claimed the adjacent plot, while Luce had taken one across the small creek that bordered their land. "It's not much," the town clerk, a nervous man named Peterson, apologized. "But the soil's good, and there's room to grow." "It's perfect," Nora said firmly. She'd started over with less. The first weeks were a whirlwind of construction and introduction. Samuel proved his worth immediately, his skill with horses drawing customers from all backgrounds. Within a month, he had more work than he could handle breaking mounts, teaching riding, doctoring injured animals with knowledge passed down from his mother's people. Nora established a small school in their front room, teaching anyone who wanted to learn Apache children struggling with English, Mexican wives seeking to read, even a few Chinese merchants eager to improve their written communication. Her journal, now famous from the trial, had established her as a woman of letters, and people trusted her with their children's education. Not everyone welcomed them. The second Sunday in Haven Springs, Nora dressed carefully for church, pinning her mother's brooch to her best dress. But when they entered the small chapel, conversations stopped. Some families shifted away from their pew, and one woman pulled her daughter close as if proximity to the Redhawks might be contagious. The minister, Reverend Josiah Mills, was a young man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. He welcomed them warmly, but Nora could feel the congregation's discomfort throughout the service. Afterward, as they filed out, a well-dressed woman blocked their path. Nora recognized her as Mrs. Harriet Winthrop, wife of the bank manager and self-appointed social arbiter of Haven Springs. "Mrs. Redhawk," she said, the name clearly distasteful on her tongue. "While we certainly support Christian charity toward the less fortunate, there are standards to maintain. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with your own kind." "And what kind would that be?" Nora asked pleasantly, though her Irish temper sparked. "Women mothers. Christians, I confess, Mrs. Winthrop. I'm so many kinds I sometimes lose track." Samuel's hand touched her elbow, a gentle reminder to choose battles wisely. But young Thomas, with a child's perfect timing, chose that moment to pipe up in clear English. "Mama, why does that lady smell like sour milk?" Several people choked on barely suppressed laughter. Mrs. Winthrop's face went purple. "I never the impudence. Children do speak their minds." Reverend Mills interjected smoothly. "As our Lord said, 'Suffer the little children to come unto me.' All children, Mrs. Winthrop, all." They became irregular churchgoers after that, attending when the Spirit moved them, but finding God more often in their daily work than in weekly sermons. Still, they'd made their point they would not be invisible or ashamed. The real test came when Pike reappeared. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, no longer in uniform, but wearing the badge of a territorial marshal. The intervening years had not been kind. His face was gaunt. His eyes burned with fanatical light, and he walked with a limp from his time in military prison. He found Nora teaching in her schoolroom. A dozen children of various backgrounds bent over their slates. Thomas played with blocks in the corner, building towers and knocking them down with gleeful abandon. "Well, well," Pike said from the doorway. "The Indian lover, playing schoolmarm. How domestic." Nora's hand found the rifle she kept mounted above the chalkboard, but she didn't reach for it, not with children present. "Marshal Pike," she said evenly. "School is in session. If you have business, it can wait until after dismissal." "My business won't wait." He stepped inside, his badge catching the light. "I'm investigating reports of sedition. Seems someone's been teaching impressionable young minds that Indians are equals to white men. That's dangerous talk. Mrs. Redhawk, bordering on treason. It's called American history. Marshal, all men are created equal. Perhaps you've heard the phrase. His face darkened. Don't quote scripture at me, woman. I know what you are, what you've done, living in sin with a savage, bearing his half-breed whelp. That's enough. Samuel's voice came from behind Pike, cold as winter wind. You're disturbing a classroom. Marshal, move along. Pike turned slowly, hand hovering near his gun. The breed speaks. Tell me, Red Hawk, does it bother you that she'll never really be yours that deep down? She knows she's degraded herself, that your mongrel son will never be accepted in either world. Samuel smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. My wife and son are teaching and learning in a school they built, in a town where they're valued, living lives of purpose. You're a disgraced soldier wearing a badge you probably bought, nursing grievances that eat you alive. Which of us has degraded himself? Pike. The two men faced each other, violence crackling between them like heat lightning. Then young Thomas, with the fearlessness of childhood, toddled between them and tugged on Pike's coat. You sad, he announced solemnly. Mama says sad people need hugs. Before anyone could react, the boy wrapped his small arms around Pike's leg in a determined embrace. For a moment, Pike stood frozen, staring down at the child clinging to him with innocent compassion. Something flickered across his face, confusion, perhaps, or a memory of what he'd been before hatred consumed him. Then he jerked away as if burned. Keep your spawn away from me, he snarled, but the venom had leaked from his voice. He backed toward the door, pointing at Nora. This isn't over. I'll be watching, one step out of line. After he left, Nora gathered Thomas into her arms, her hands shaking. The other children sat wide-eyed and silent. Is the mean man coming back? Little Maria Sandoval asked. Perhaps, Nora said honestly. But mean people only have the power we give them, and we're not giving him any, are we? No, ma'am, the children chorused. And just like that, the moment passed. But Pike's presence cast a shadow over Haven Springs. He took a room at the boarding house, spent his days watching and his evenings drinking, spreading poison wherever he could. Some listened, old prejudices stirring. Others, remembering how the Redhawks had contributed to the town, stood firm. The crisis came at the town meeting to elect a new sheriff. Pike had put his name forward, claiming his experience made him the best choice to maintain order and Christian values. His opponent was Marcus Freeman, a former Buffalo soldier who ran the livery stable with quiet competence. The meeting was held in the church, packed to overflowing. Nora sat with the other women on one side, though several made sure to leave space around her. Samuel stood with the men, Thomas on his shoulders. Pike spoke first, his message clear. Haven Springs was an experiment in danger of failure, corrupted by liberal ideas and racial mixing. Only strong leadership could save it from becoming a den of vice and miscegenation. Look around you, he thundered. Chinese heathens peddling their wares, Mexicans refusing to speak English, Indians walking free as white men, and worse, white women forgetting their place, their race, their God-given duty to preserve purity. Some applauded, more than Nora had hoped, fewer than she'd feared. Marcus Freeman spoke simply. I've worn a uniform. I've fought for this country. I've seen what happens when we let fear and hatred guide us. Haven Springs is meant to be different, a place where a man's worth is measured by his actions, not his ancestry. If that's the experiment, I say we see it through. The debate raged for hours. Accusations flew, tempers flared, and at one point it seemed violence might erupt. Then Reverend Mills called for testimony from citizens about the candidates. One by one, people stood. The Chinese merchant, whose son Nora tutored in English. The Mexican farmer whom Samuel had helped save his cattle from poisoning. The white widow whose children played safely with Apache youngsters. Small stories, everyday kindnesses, the mundane fabric of community life. When Nora stood, the room fell silent. 3 years ago, I lost everything to hatred and greed, she said. I could have let it make me bitter, make me small. Instead, I found love, family, purpose. I found home. Marshall Pike asks you to choose fear. I ask you to choose hope. Haven Springs isn't perfect, no place is, but it's ours to build or destroy. Choose wisely. The vote was closer than it should have been, 87 for Freeman, 73 for Pike. But it was enough. Pike left that very night, vanishing into the darkness from which he'd come, though Nora suspected they hadn't seen the last of him. As autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Nora stood in her expanded schoolhouse, a proper building now, with funds raised by parents grateful for their children's education. 23 students bent over their lessons, speaking a babble of languages during recess, but united in their pursuit of knowledge. Samuel had built a real horse training facility, drawing clients from as far as Santa Fe. James served as the town's tracker and hunting guide, while Luz had opened a small restaurant serving food that brought cultures together on a single plate. Thomas, now walking steadily and talking constantly, moved between worlds with the fluid grace of the truly bicultural. He knew when to be still and respectful in Apache fashion, when to be bold in the American way, and how to charm in any language. He'll be a bridge builder, Mary had said during her last visit, like his parents. The town wasn't paradise. Prejudice still lurked in corners, conflict still arose, and the outside world's pressures never ceased. But it was theirs, this improbable community, where Apache and Irish, Mexican and Chinese, former slaves and former soldiers worked to create something new under the vast western sky. As Nora locked the schoolhouse and walked home through streets where her mixed family drew fewer stairs each passing month, she thought about bridges, not the grand spans of engineering, but the small daily crossings, a shared meal, a helped neighbor, a child learning to read in multiple languages. Perhaps that's how the world changed, not in dramatic battles, but in quiet choices. One schoolroom, one friendship, one accepting nod at a time. "Mama, up," Thomas demanded, and she swung him onto her hip, his weight familiar and precious. Together they headed home, where Samuel would be waiting with dinner and stories, and the simple miracle of a life built on ground that shouldn't have been able to support it, but somehow, against all odds, did. 5 years had passed since Pike's defeat at the town meeting, and Haven Springs had grown from an experiment into a true community. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing with it both opportunity and challenge. Nora stood on the platform of the new depot, watching the Iron Horse discharge its cargo of dreamers and schemers, families and fortune seekers. Mrs. "Red Hawk?" A familiar voice called out. She turned to see Judge Morrison stepping down from the train. His hair now completely silver, but his bearing still commanding. "I hoped I'd find you here." "Judge," she greeted him warmly. "What brings you back to Haven Springs?" His expression grew serious. "Silas Crane. He's out of prison and making moves to claim the railroad-adjacent lands, including, I'm afraid, a significant portion of Haven Springs." Nora's heart sank. She'd known this day would come. The very success of their community made it a target for those who saw only profit where others had built homes. That evening, the town council convened in emergency session. Samuel sat beside Marcus Freeman, now in his second term as sheriff. James represented the Apache families, while Luz spoke for the Mexican community. The Chinese merchants had chosen elderly Mr. Chen, whose broken English belied a sharp legal mind. Morrison laid out the situation. "Crane has papers possibly forged. Definitely questionable, claiming prior rights to much of the land Haven Springs sits on. He's also brought a team of lawyers and, more concerning, hired guns." "How many?" Samuel asked. 20, maybe 30 men, not soldiers worse. Mercenaries who work for whoever pays best." The room erupted in worried voices. Some advocated fighting, others fleeing. Nora watched her husband's face, seeing the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders. At 7, Thomas sat quietly beside his father, absorbing every word with eyes that missed nothing. "There's another way, mister," Chen said quietly. When the room stilled, he continued. "In San Francisco, when the rail barons tried to seize Chinatown, we didn't fight with guns. We fought with papers, laws, newspapers. We made it more expensive for them to take than to negotiate." "Crane owns judges," someone protested. "Not all of them," Morrison interjected. "And more importantly, he doesn't own the newspapers back east or the federal government. President Cleveland has been looking for ways to curtail the railroad monopolies. If we can make Crane the face of corruption." They worked through the night, crafting a strategy that relied on law and public opinion rather than bullets. But everyone knew violence might still come. It arrived 3 days later in the form of Crane himself, riding into town with his hired guns like a conquering general. He was older now, paunchier, but his eyes held the same cold greed Nora remembered. He found her teaching, as Pike once had, but this time she wasn't alone. Parents stood along the walls, Apache warriors, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese merchants, former slaves, and white settlers, all united in protecting their children's education. "Mrs. Redhawk," Crane tipped his hat mockingly, "still corrupting young minds, I see." "Mr. Crane, still stealing what others have built, I see." His face flushed. "I'm claiming what's legally mine. This land was granted to the Railroad Consortium before your experiment began." "Interesting," Nora said calmly. "Because I have here the original land patents, signed by the territorial governor, dated 2 years before your supposed claim." She held up the documents Morrison had brought. "I also have sworn affidavits from the surveyors who mapped this area, confirming no prior railroad claims existed." "Papers can be forged." Crane sneered. "Yes," Nora agreed pleasantly. "They certainly can, which is why Judge Morrison has requested a federal investigation into the authenticity of all land claims in the region. I'm sure your documents will stand up to scrutiny." Crane's composure cracked. "You think you're clever, don't you? A high-minded schoolteacher playing at law. But papers don't stop bullets. Mrs. Redhawk, accidents happen on the frontier. Fires start, people disappear." "Is that a threat, Mr. Crane?" Sheriff Freeman stepped forward, his deputies flanking him. "Because threatening citizens in front of witnesses is a crime, even for rich men." The standoff stretched taut. Crane's hired guns shifted restlessly, hands near weapons. The parents in the schoolhouse stood firm, protecting their children with their bodies if necessary. Then Thomas did what Thomas always did, the unexpected. The boy stood up from his desk and walked directly to Crane, looking up at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed older than his years. "My papa says men who steal are weak," he said clearly. "They take because they can't build. Are you weak, Mr. Crane?" For a moment, Crane stared at the boy, this embodiment of everything he claimed to despise. Mixed-blood child of a white woman and an Apache man, speaking with eloquence and courage. "Get that half-breed brat away from me," he snarled, raising his hand. He never completed the gesture. Samuel's hand caught his wrist in a grip like iron. "Touch my son," he said quietly, "and federal investigation will be the least of your worries." The hired guns reached for weapons, but found themselves staring down the barrels of rifles held by parents who'd fought in a dozen conflicts and survived them all. "Gentlemen," Morrison's voice cut through the tension, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more appropriate venue. Mr. Crane, my telegram to Washington has already been sent. Federal marshals will arrive within the week to investigate your claims. Until then, I suggest you and your men camp outside town limits. Haven Springs has ordinances about armed gatherings." Crane jerked free of Samuel's grip, his face mottled with rage. "This isn't over, not by half. You people think you can stand against progress, against the natural order. I'll see this mongrel town burned to the ground before I'm done." After he stormed out, Nora gathered Thomas close, feeling him tremble slightly despite his brave front. Around them, parents comforted children, the community drawing together as it always did in crisis. The next days were tense. Crane's men made camp just outside town limits, their presence a constant threat. But Haven Springs didn't cower. Instead, they prepared not just for violence, but for the legal and political battle ahead. Nora wrote letters to Eastern newspapers, telling the story of Haven Springs, a place where former enemies worked together, where children of all backgrounds learned side by side, where the American dream was being lived rather than just preached. Samuel and James organized the town's defense, teaching shopkeepers and farmers to work together as they had in the Apache bands. Luce coordinated the women, ensuring every family had supplies and safe places to shelter if violence erupted. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A young journalist named Theodore Whitman arrived on the train, sent by the New York Herald to cover the Haven Springs controversy. He was green, eager, and absolutely fascinated by the town's unique character. "This is remarkable," he said, interviewing Nora in her schoolhouse. "Children who speak 3 languages, former soldiers of both sides working together, Apache and settlers sharing knowledge. This is the America we claim to be but rarely achieve." His articles, wired back east, painted a picture that captured the nation's imagination. Letters of support poured in. A senator from Massachusetts raised questions about railroad land grabs. Church groups sent donations. Veterans organizations praised the town's integration of former soldiers regardless of which army they'd served. Crane fought back with his own propaganda, hiring writers to paint Haven Springs as a den of miscegenation and savagery. But his hired pens couldn't match the authenticity of Whitman's reporting or the photographs that accompanied them, Thomas reading to younger children, Samuel training horses with white ranchers, Luce and Chinese merchants planning the harvest festival together. The federal marshals arrived as promised, led by a stern man named Captain Brooks, who'd lost an arm at Gettysburg and had no patience for corruption. His investigation was thorough and damning. Crane's documents were indeed forged, his surveys fraudulent, his entire claim a fabrication designed to steal legally settled land. But Crane had one last card to play. On the night before the marshals were to arrest him, his hired guns moved toward the town, intending to create enough chaos to cover his escape and destroy the evidence against him. They didn't expect the entire town to be waiting. The confrontation at the town limits would be remembered as the Night of Lights. Every building glowed with lanterns. Every able-bodied adult stood ready not as separate groups but as one community. Apache warriors stood beside Chinese merchants, Mexican vaqueros beside former slaves, white settlers beside all. "Turn back," Sheriff Freeman called out. "There's no profit in dying for a man who's already lost." Some of Crane's mercenaries, seeing the odds, did exactly that. Others, too deep in Crane's pocket or too fond of violence, tried to push through. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. Disciplined volleys from covered positions, the tactical knowledge of veterans from multiple wars, and the absolute determination of people defending their homes proved too much for hired guns used to intimidating isolated targets. When the smoke cleared, 3 mercenaries lay dead, several wounded, and the rest in custody or fleeing into the desert. Haven Springs had suffered only minor injuries, a testament to preparation and unity. Crane himself was captured trying to board a late-night train, his bags full of cash and incriminating documents. His trial in federal court was swift, his conviction certain. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire divided among creditors and victims. As dawn broke over Haven Springs, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, the townspeople gathered in the square. They were battered, exhausted, but unbroken. Morrison, who'd stayed to see it through, addressed the crowd. "You've done something remarkable here, not just in defending your homes, but in proving what America could be, a place where different peoples come together, not in spite of their differences, but because of them." Nora stood with her family, Samuel's arm around her shoulders. Thomas between them, and their younger children, Sarah, age 3, and baby Patrick in their arms. Around them stood their extended family of choice, James and his wife, Luz and her children, Mr. Chen and his family, the Freemans, and dozens of others who'd chosen to build something new on the frontier. "We're not done," Samuel said quietly to Nora. "There will be other Cranes, other Pikes, people who can't stand what we represent. Then we'll face them," Nora replied. "Together." As the sun climbed higher, Thomas broke free from his parents and ran to play with the other children, Apache and Mexican, Chinese and African, European and mixed, all laughing in the universal language of childhood. Watching them, Nora thought about the night in the storm that had started it all. She'd lost a ranch but gained a world. She'd defied convention and found a love that transcended boundaries. She'd helped build a community that proved the cynics wrong. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still full of those who would take rather than build. But here in Haven Springs, on this dawn after victory, the future seemed bright with possibility. "I'll be gentle," Samuel had promised her once, in a cave with rain falling and the world uncertain. He'd kept that promise in all ways, gentle in love, in parenting, in building rather than destroying. And together, they'd created something that would outlast them all. A place where being different wasn't a curse, but a blessing. Where children could grow up proud of all their heritage. Where the American experiment actually worked. The town bell rang, calling people to breakfast and the beginning of another day. Life went on, as it always did, but somehow richer for having been tested and not found wanting. In her journal that night, Nora wrote, "We prevailed not because we were stronger or more righteous, but because we stood together. In the end, that's all civilization really is. People choosing to build rather than tear down, to include rather than exclude, to hope rather than fear. Today, we chose hope. Tomorrow, we'll choose it again." And they did, year after year, generation after generation, until Haven Springs became not just a town but a symbol proof that even in the wildest places, humanity's best angels could prevail. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the Old West. I hope Eleanor and Samuel's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this story. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles, just like the diverse community of Haven Springs connected across their differences. If you enjoyed this tale of love conquering prejudice and communities choosing hope over fear, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories that bring the frontier to life. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and please consider clicking the hype button to help more people discover these tales of courage, love, and the true spirit of the American West. Until next time, keep riding toward your own horizon.